So now we are moving to Katherine, please.
Yes, thank you. And I feel bad speaking after Itai because although I'm passionate about the subject, I don't think that I can demonstrate it in quite the same intensity as he just did. So
that's why they invite me. I'm the circus performer.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposal that we put out in March and talked about at the OECD panel back then around really a formulary method. And I'll talk a little bit about how things have evolved as we put that out with, I think, only a few days to provide it, and the reaction both from a sort of government perspective, NGO perspective, and certainly the multinational corporate perspective on the proposal. Let's see here. The first thing I want to say is we are not bound by the method that we put out there. We really want a method that focuses on simplicity. We really want a method that would cut down on the number of disputes that we have on this. And we also feel very strongly about the arm's length standard being kept for the rest of the supply chain. And so I think some of the comments that we had earlier from Pascal and from Mike as to where the arm's length standard works best, I think the arm's length standard works best when it's a more complicated fact pattern. And I would direct you maybe back to the proposals at the early part of this decade that were put out by the OECD on simplification and safe harbors, and the concept that we could come to an agreement that may not be arm's length, but focused on limited risk distribution models, focused on contract R&D, and focused on contract manufacturing. And although many of us initially were nervous about going away from the arm's length standard in that, at the end of the day, we said, okay, those are areas that we could get the benefit of simplicity and certainty as a trade-off to using the arm's length standard. So that being said, I think most of you will hopefully be familiar with our formula. It's not as grand as some of the ones that we've just seen, but at its core, it really looks at a base rate and then levers that base rate up or down based on a couple of factors. And the first of those factors is trying to address the marketing intangibles proposal with the residual profit method. I was, offended, honestly, that if we were going to move away from the arm's length standard, we were going to do something as complex as a residual profit split method. And Amy's going to talk us through some of the complexities of residual profit split methods. And so I put together this proposal to really say, how could you do this in a way that would be simple? And especially, I think about the developing countries and the resources that they have in those countries for them to be able to assess whether or not the residual profit split method allows them to understand why they're getting the amount of taxation that they have. And so I think this formula is pretty simple in terms of knowing, first of all, what the total system profit is. And I think to the earlier points, there's certainly some questions about how the accounting works for what is total system profit, but I think at a gross level, I think that's achievable.
It's a gross level. I agree. The gross level.
The other thing it relies on is really the level of marketing expense in a particular country. And so it looks to find what the proper level of taxation would be based on developing what the return on sales would be for marketing, distribution, and sales in a particular country. So our model starts with a base of 3%. It then starts to lever up in lever one or lever down in lever one based on overall profitability of the company. And we'll talk in a second about the numbers. The second lever was trying to get at the point of marketing intangibles, and maybe try and dig down a little bit on where you have sort of a B2B business that doesn't have a lot of marketing promotional costs versus a B2C business that perhaps has more of a advertising promotion type of spend there, and trying to get at the fact that perhaps marketing intangibles are more prevalent where you have more of a B2C business than you do to a B2G business or a B2B business. And the last thing we did was we said there should really be a floor and a ceiling here in this formula. Well, this is probably the initial most controversial thing that we said in March was, I think the floor should be 0. So I don't think that a marketing company in any jurisdiction should really be sharing in the losses of a total multinational corporation. And the other part that I looked at here was really what should be the maximum amount that goes to the local market distributor. I've put 40% in there. It really only happens, and we'll talk about why that only happens, when you have a very low operating margin for the whole enterprise. So I was thinking about the companies that earn 5% overall, and what do I think is a fair answer? And I decided that sort of 2% seemed like a fair answer there. That's how I came up with the 40%. Very debatable. I think we were very clear that these were illustrative numbers in the actual paper, but they're not random numbers, right? So I didn't just come up with these numbers and say, yeah, I think 3%, 12%, 20% are the right numbers here. I did start from my background of the arm's length standard. And let's start with that 3% base rate. This is my 27th year in transfer pricing. I've seen a lot of comparable company searches. I've seen them in different regions. I've seen them in different industries. I've seen a lot there. And I'm going to be honest that 3% could be at the bottom of the range, could be at the top of the range, could be in the middle of the range. It is generally there for distributors. You might hike that down because you're going to say, I'm a limited risk distributor, and therefore I can make adjustments to the original comp sets. Granted, you could. You could also make other adjustments for working capital, et cetera. That might move things in one way or another. At the end of the day, though, I was thinking about overall, on a global basis, 3% seemed like a good number to start with. I then address in lever 1, really, how do I make sure that I'm addressing the question of whether residual profit should be allocated to the local marketing company? And I do that by looking at, first of all, a benchmark. And I chose the benchmark of 12%. If some of you have read Apple's comments and other people's comments, 12% is about the average. I think it's 12.3% is the average operating margin. And I'm going to use the terms operating margin and return on sales interchangeably here. That's the average operating margin of the 1,200 largest global companies. That's a range of industries. It's not specific to any particular industry. It is sort of biased in that it's the largest companies. And recently I've been told that if I was to look at Amadeus, the answer would be 5%, which seems low to me. In terms of whether there's any profit left over that is residual in those cases. So I take that 12% and I compare it to the enterprise operating margin. And I take a portion of that difference to either lever up the 3% or lever down the 3%. And that's my first step. My second step, right, is to look at that marketing spend in the country. And am I spending more than 10% of sales, less than 10% of sales? I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on lever 2 because I think as Sophie and others know, The day after I spoke in Paris, I met with the OECD, and I said, you know what, I don't really like lever 2 there. I think it's not the right way to look at it, but it's illustrative if you really want to hammer on this question of marketing intangibles, which I'm not sure that I really think is a great idea. So if we look at our formula here, what does it look like in practice? So I'm going to talk here about sort of the lever 1. And I would say that the reaction to our proposal in March, and like I said, I think we were the only people that put out a specific method with numbers that you could calculate. So as I'm sure you can all imagine, within a week of that talk, about 30 companies came to us and said, I want to understand what our margin would be if you put this together. And so if we look at that lever 1 again, what's the one number that I haven't talked about in lever 1? It's the 20%, right? It's the 20% of the difference. And that, to me, is the critical question for us. Effectively, if you look at our formula, we start with a 3% base rate, and our average return is a 12% enterprise operating margin. So we are starting off by giving the distribution company 25% of the system profit, right? 3 divided by 12. If we think about 25% of the total operating profit, the 20% that I'm putting on the residual means the higher you are in profitability, the closer and closer you're going to get to 20% of the system profit being allocated to the market countries. Now, that is one number that I don't have empirical evidence on. I mean, I would love it if somebody here who's a scholar would love to take that question on. I'm sure that there must be a lot of data about how companies share profits between unrelated distribution companies and manufacturing or product type of companies. Because I think that's actually the critical question that needs to be answered, is what proportion of the system profit should be going to the market countries. Now, a lot of discussion has been around my 3% base rate and whether or not 12% is the right thing to start off with. And I actually think those are fairly irrelevant in the question, because you could design this using other numbers and get to really the same result. Because the result here that I was going for was I wanted to have an answer that was somewhere between 20 and 25% of the system profits going to the distribution entities. That's on an average basis. Obviously, the less profitable you are, potentially it's more than 20%. And I don't want to say that, to Itai's point, that if there's any arm's length standard here, I did really use those 27 years of transfer pricing in trying to decide what I thought was a fair number and a fair bump, right, in terms of having a higher amount of profitability than we have in the current system today. So it's really interesting to look at what it would be if we just changed a few parameters. I kept the base rate of 12%, just because I didn't want to make it too complicated for everybody to understand. But on those scenarios that I showed on the previous page, and you'll see that the numbers in the first column there are, in fact, the numbers on the previous page. If we have an enterprise operating margin of, let's say, let's pick 15 or 25%. It seems to me all the companies that came to me to complain tended to be the higher profit companies. Right, you see that 25% showed 5.6% at the beginning, and that's somewhere between 20 and 25%. It goes down to 4.5% if we reduce the base rate to 2.5%, and we only take 15% of the difference between the 12% benchmark and the overall enterprise operating margin. So now in the system, we are leaving somewhere around 85% to the rest of the system. And in the last, which seems to be somewhat satisfying some of the companies out there today, we're saying, let's look at just 10 to 15% of the enterprise system profit going to the local country distribution. And this, to me, is where the conversation should be. We should be focused on what proportion of the enterprise profits should be going to the local marketing companies, not whether or not 3% is the right base rate, not whether or not 12% is the right benchmark to figure out what the difference is, but really, fundamentally, what do we think the answer to this is, right? I chose 20 to 25% because I thought it was a bump from where most companies are. I've been told that I'm completely wrong on this, and that really probably option 1, option 2, or option 3, sort of the 15%, or the more 15 to 20% is the right number out there. The question is, of course, what is right? Because if we're abandoning the arm's length standard here, is it right that this amount goes here? And that brings me to the topic that Pascal and others have talked about today, which is principles, right? And I think that this answer needs to be rooted in principles. Otherwise, we do have BEPS 3.0 after companies decide that their coffers aren't high enough, and all of a sudden we need to move up from 15% of the system profit to 20% of the system profit. And I do think some empirical evidence there would be very helpful. I think the formulary method is difficult to comprehend if you have been doing this for a long time, because there's an inherent trade-off between simplicity and what I'll call accuracy. And so a lot of when I put this together and looked at it, I really struggled with what I thought the right transfer pricing answer was under the arm's length standard versus what is the right answer in terms of simplicity. And I think that that is one of the big challenges that Richard and the rest of the Secretariat and those 130 countries are going to have to wrestle with. How do you balance really on a knife's edge between quote-unquote accuracy and simplicity there? And I think the other big criticism that I will just mention now is this formulary method does not take into account the actual activities, right? Again, that's a arm's length way of looking at things, so it does not take that into account. Although I don't think that lever 2 works in terms of marketing, I was proposing for most of this year that lever 2 should really try and separate where you have, let's say, the GAFA companies that don't have the physical presence from a company that has a lot of physical presence, has warehouses, has big sales forces, et cetera. I've run into a bit of a stumbling block there because there's no consensus, and in fact, 2 very opposing views, one of which is that the companies without any presence should pay more tax than the companies that actually have the presence, versus my thoughts, which were if you do a lot in the country, you should pay higher amounts than if you don't have any presence in the country. And that is actually not only a multinational corporation issue, but I'm also seeing that with the government folks that we are talking to in terms of what their belief is on that particular point. But that's really where I think if we're going to have a lever 2, it should distinguish between the types of models that we have in a particular country, as opposed to putting the same amount in every country, which I think could also be based on the question of sort of regional versus product line versus sort of sector type of analyses. It's a difficult, again, weighting of accuracy and simplicity, but I do think that you're not going to get an answer that you like if you mush everything together in a particular country, especially not for a company like J&J, where we have a big pharmaceutical business that's more than 50% of our revenues as of last year, a medical device business, and a consumer business, all of which had very different models, very different values of marketing intangibles, and very different levels of overall profitability. And I could go on forever on what I think the questions are about implementation, but I'm very interested to hear what Amy has to say.
Thank you very much, Katherine.